The anime begins by showing Roxy, Talhan, and Alanales, who has arrived on the Devil's Continent. Meanwhile, Rudeus, Eris, and Rudeus are trying to raise enough money to pay for the voyage to the Millis continent. That night, when Rudeus fell asleep, he again dreamed of meeting a human god, and this time the god asked him to go to the market and feed a small child who was in trouble in a narrow alley. The next morning, Rudeus rushed to the market to buy food and turned into a narrow alley to give the food to the little girl he had first met. It turned out that the person he fed was one of the demon queens named Kishirika, who was waiting for someone to be given her special magic power. Because Rudeus had given her delicious food, Kishirika also thanked him by giving him one of the 12 demon eyes that she had. If the demon eye is activated, Rudeus will have the ability to see what will happen in the future. 2 weeks had passed, and Rudeus' team still hadn't collected enough money to pay for the voyage to the Millis continent. Coincidentally, a male swordsman named Garrus heard their troubles. He offers to help pay for all the shipping costs for the Rudeus team with an agreement that they must be willing to help him take care of the contraband he has. Rudeus' team was forced to accept the offer because they had no other way to go to the Millis continent, even though Garrus didn't want to tell them about the item he had smuggled. The next day, Rudeus and Eris set off by boarding the top of the ship, while Rudeus would hide in the lower cabin of the ship with Garrus' other contraband. After sailing for several hours, they finally arrived at the port of Millis continent, and Rudeus' team prepared to get off the ship. However, when Rudeus intends to pick up Rudeus from the cabin under the ship, he finds out that the items that Garrus smuggled in are children of animal races who want to be traded as slaves. This obviously made Rudeus' team feel very angry. Even though Garrus had helped them sail to their destination, they couldn't stay silent about the crimes committed by Garrus. Therefore, Rudeus' team immediately killed all the guards and captured Garrus before finally Rudeus and Eris left the ship with all the animal race children who had been kidnapped by Garrus. Meanwhile, Rudeus tries to save a large dog, another Garrus group prisoner. Unfortunately, after he managed to save the dog, 2 men from the animal race suddenly appeared and caught him. Rudeus was taken to prison by them because they thought he was one of the group members that kidnapped their children. Rudeus can only wait for help from Rudeus and Eris because all his wands have been confiscated by the animal races. A few days after Rudeus stayed in prison, came a man named Geese, who was also a prisoner of the animal race because he had cheated in gambling. That night, the animal race village is suddenly attacked by other members of a child trafficking organization who again intend to kidnap animal race children. Rudeus and Geese decided to help the animal race to save their children with the security forces from the animal race. After a very fierce battle, Rudeus finally managed to defeat Garrus and all the remaining members of the kidnapping organization. As a result of this incident, the animal race chief and the head of the security forces, Gaze, realized that Rudeus was not a member of the kidnapping group. On the other hand, Soros, the village leader of Fatoa, must be willing to accept the death penalty from King Asura because he failed to deal with the magic mana explosion disaster, which resulted in many people being injured. Back to Rudeus and his team, they are still trapped in the world of the animal race because the road that is the access to get out is still blocked by a big flood. Therefore, they decided to stay in the animal race village until the flood began to recede. When Eris played with Gaze's 2 daughters, Minotona and Tursina, Gaze felt familiar with the ring in Eris's hand. Eris tells Gaze that the ring is the ring given by Ghislaine on her 10th birthday. Hearing this, he looked surprised because it turned out that Ghislaine was Gaze's younger sister, who had been away from the animal race village for quite a long time. Ghislaine's father also felt very proud after knowing that Ghislaine had turned into a very great swordsman and even became a magic teacher for members of the kingdom. The next day when Rudeus' team was about to leave for the Millis continent, Gaze asked Eris for help to deliver his news to Ghislaine. After traveling for hours, Rudeus' team finally arrived at Millis continent, which means they were one step closer to Fatoa village. While relaxing at the inn, Rudeus saw a group of people who were very suspicious because they were acting like kidnappers. However, upon further investigation, he found that they were not a group of kidnappers but a group on a mission to save their family members from slavery. And the person who led the group in carrying out the mission was Rudeus' father, who was none other than Paul. After being separated for about 5 years, Rudeus was very happy because he finally got to meet his father. He told all the stories of the adventures he went through to get to the Millis continent. After telling his father many things, Rudeus introduced him to Eris and Rudeus, who had accompanied him on his journey to Fatoa. In the afternoon, Paul and Rudeus' team started discussing making plans for their next trip. On a mission to find the whereabouts of Zenith, Lilia, and Aisha, Rudeus' team decides to continue the search to the central continent, while Paul and Geese will search the Great Forest. Meanwhile, Roxy and her team are still gathering information regarding the traces of Rudeus and his family. Before continuing the journey, Roxy decided to return to her village for a while because she had been separated from her family for too long. When Roxy arrived at her house, her parents felt very happy and welcomed her arrival with a warm hug. From the story of her parents, Roxy finally learned that Rudeus had come to their village 2 years ago. After meeting with her parents, Roxy and her team continued their journey to find the whereabouts of Rudeus and his family. Elsewhere, Rudeus again meets the god in his dream and gets a clue about the whereabouts of Aisha and Lilia. In the dream, the god said he would find Lilia in the kingdom of Siren, but strangely the god told him not to tell Aisha his real identity. After arriving at the central continent, Rudeus' team rushed to continue their journey to the territory of the Siren kingdom. When Rudeus was walking through the territory of the kingdom of Siren as ordered by the god, he met a little girl who turned out to be Aisha. At that time, she tried to give him a letter, but the letter was immediately seized by the royal guards, and Aisha was almost arrested by the royal guards. Rudeus had no choice but to use his magic power to defeat the royal guards and save her. After Rudeus took Aisha to the hideout of his team, she then told him that Lilia was currently being held captive by one of the princes of the Siren kingdom named Pax. Hearing this, Rudeus decided to go to the Siren kingdom alone while Rudeus and Eris would be tasked with taking care of Aisha for the time being. After arriving at the palace, Rudeus was brought before Pax, who was holding Lilia hostage, who was already in a limp and helpless state. Not only that, but Pax has trapped Rudeus into a barrier circle that makes him unable to use his magic power. Apparently, Pax intends to take Rudeus hostage so he can lure Roxy because Pax has been so obsessed with making her his girlfriend. Shortly after Pax left the room where Rudeus was being held, a prince of another kingdom named Zanoba came to Rudeus. At first, he thought that Zanoba would do bad things to him, but it turned out that he actually came to Rudeus's place to help him escape from that place. It turned out that all this time, Zanoba really admired all the miniature artworks that Rudeus had made, so he already considered Rudeus his master in the arts. Long story short, thanks to the help of Zanoba, Rudeus was finally able to get out of the Siren kingdom and save Lilia from Pax's hand. In rescuing Lilia, Rudeus' team has successfully freed all family members from the soldiers held hostage by Pax. After that, Rudeus decided to send Aisha and Lilia to the Millie's continent so they could live safely and peacefully with Paul. Meanwhile, Rudeus and his team will return to continue their journey to the central continent, searching for Zenith's whereabouts. To get to the central continent, Rudeus and his team had to pass through ice mountains that were very cold and experienced frequent blizzards. Also, the iceberg is dangerous because the mountains become a home for a very fierce red dragon. Therefore, Rudeus advised his team to always be careful so that they do not attract the attention of the red dragon. As they passed through a cave passage, Eris and Rudeus suddenly froze in fear as they felt the presence of a very powerful being. Surprisingly, Rudeus couldn't even feel any aura like they did. After passing through a very thick fog, Rudeus' team met two mysterious people walking toward them. Rudeus warned Rudeus not to get into trouble because they could be dangerous. Shortly after, the two mysterious people suddenly attacked Rudeus after discovering that he had a relationship with a human god. Eris and Rudeus tried to protect Rudeus, but because the man's strength was powerful, they could easily be defeated by the man. As a result, Rudeus and his team were brutally beaten by the man until they all dying. When Rudeus falls unconscious, he again meets the human god, who tells him that the man is a dragon god named Orsted, one of the strongest gods of the 7 great gods. But the human god didn't tell Rudeus why Orsted was so hostile to the human god. Not long after, Rudeus regained his senses because Orsted had healed his wounds before he left the place. Rudeus still doesn't know why Orsted did all that, but fortunately, he can continue his journey with his team. A few days later, Rudeus and Eris finally arrived at Fatoa village, and Rudeus' task of helping the two of them was finished. Before Rudeus said goodbye to Rudeus and Eris, he thanked them because they had helped him return the good name of the supered race. Rudeus will continue his adventure alone, while Rudeus and Eris will go to the camp where the villagers of Fatoa are taking refuge. After arriving at the refuge, Ghislaine greeted Rudeus and Eris warmly. Unfortunately, that happiness didn't last long because Eris had to accept that her parents and grandfather had died in the mono-wave explosion disaster. Not only that, but the royal advisor, Alphonse, said that Eris would be appointed as the concubine of the king of Bilemond, and if she refused, the people of Fatoa village would be punished by the king. This obviously triggers a debate between Alphonse and Ghislaine because she doesn't want Eris to marry someone she doesn't love. After a long debate, Eris decided to go on an adventure with Ghislaine and left the village of Fatoa with Rudeus. On the other hand, Roxy, stopping at a nightclub, accidentally met Kishirika, who had been tied up by someone. She helped Kishirika by releasing the bonds from her body, and as a thank you, Kishirika helped her by telling her the location of Zenith's whereabouts. Using the power of Kishirika's demon eye, she learns that Zenith is currently living in a remote village called Labyrinth City on the Begalan continent. Unfortunately, Kishirika sensed that Zenith's current health condition was very weak, and she couldn't make sure that Zenith was in a safe situation. Hearing that, Roxy, Talhand, and Alanales immediately rushed to the Begalan continent before it was too late. On the other hand, Rudeus finally came back from feeling down after Eris left him alone. He decided to return to continue the journey alone until he could find the whereabouts of Zenith. The moral that can be learned from this anime is to help anyone who needs help, just like Rudeus, who still helps others even though he is accused of being a kidnapper.